Layne Staley always seemed to carry two worlds inside him: a world brimming with irreverent humor, teenage daydreams of rock stardom, and an instinctive desire to comfort and protect those he loved, and another far darker world where heartbreak and addiction lurked in every shadow. He became a hero of the grunge era, but behind the moody stage presence and guttural screams lay a kid who, from the time he was small, was riding the highs and lows of a life shaped by divorce, by a fierce determination to sing, and by an entire city's changing musical landscape. Layne's story is one of wild leaps forward and sudden, crushing setbacks, of friendships lost and found, of mother-son feuds and reconciliations, of bold decisions to name a band Alice in Chains despite parental fury, and of a final lonely departure from a world that had once held so much promise for him. He was born Layne Rutherford Staley on August 22, 1967, in Bellevue, Washington, into a family with no illusions about stability. His mother Nancy's maiden name was Layne, which is where his first name came from, but young Layne loathed the Rutherford part from an early age. He raged whenever someone used it. By the time he was a teenager, he'd changed that middle name to Thomas, apparently taking a cue from rock drummer Tommy Lee. Yet even that was just superficial rebellion for a kid who felt things deeply, who always wore his anger or sadness close to the surface. His family shattered when he was 7. Father Phil and Mother Nancy split up. He ended up living with his mother and a stepfather named Jim Elmer. They had their share of friction, but Layne also gained an adopted brother, Ken Elmer, who would later help him find his path into music by hooking him up with local players. Before long, the shy boy with the big eyes was wrestling with a swirl of teenage angst, with music as the one thing that seemed to give him direction. Whenever people asked him what he wanted to be, he'd say, "I'm going to be a singer." He wrote that down in Dr. Seuss's All About Me at age 9. Unlike many kids who change dreams with the seasons, he stuck with that vow for life. His father's absence, though, left a raw wound. The divorce impacted him more than his mother, or anyone else, fully grasped, and it would shape his entire worldview. He discovered an outlet in rock and metal records from his parents' stash. The roar of Black Sabbath in particular reached him. He also took in influences like Twisted Sister, The Stooges, Ministry, Skinny Puppy, picking up tastes that would eventually meld into his own unique style. Yet he hesitated to step fully into the role of vocalist. He started out on drums in middle school glam bands, not quite sure if he should trust himself behind a microphone. All the same, the longing to sing never left him. By the time he was 12, he'd joined a handful of local groups, mostly playing drums, while privately harboring the dream of being front and center. It took a push from the right people at the right time for him to finally seize a microphone and never let go. That push came around 1984, courtesy of a group of Shorewood High School students named James Bergstrom, Johnny Bacolas, and Zoli Seminate, who'd formed a band called Sleaze. They needed a singer, and Layne was on the radar as a possibility, though he was still insecure about his vocal chops, but in part because of a little nudging from his older brother Ken Elmer, Layne showed up for an audition. He was shy, not quite the brash, chest-thumping alpha you'd expect from a budding rock star. But the minute he started singing, the bandmates realized they'd found something special. That slight frame housed an astonishing voice, gritty yet soulful, with a smoky undertone that carried emotion even when he was just fooling around. They asked him to join on the spot. He said yes, though he didn't know this was going to be the first big step in a life of music. His time in Sleaze introduced him to the local scene. They scored a minor label interest, had cameo appearances on public access TV, and got a taste of the spotlight. But the lineup constantly changed and the momentum was shaky. Layne was the one constant in that band, doggedly sticking with it even as friends left or new guitarists showed up. Eventually, in 1986, the group rebranded as Alice in Chains at the urging of Johnny Bacolas. The name was a spin on Alice in Wonderland, but also with a wink at bondage imagery. Some found it scandalous. So did Layne's mother, Nancy, who was furious at the suggestion of a girl in chains, considering it offensive. They argued intensely. Mother and son had never clashed so hard. But Layne, with the rebellious humor he nurtured, insisted it was all just a comedic subversion, and he refused to let go. They compromised by spelling it Alice in Chains, softening the explicit connotations. She was still upset, but the tension cooled. They resumed speaking. For Layne, this was a small but significant victory. He'd staked a claim on his right to define himself, ignoring others' discomfort. Even so, that version of the band, Alice in Chains, didn't last. By 1987, the group fell apart, leaving Layne bandless again. But fate was about to intervene. Enter Jerry Cantrell, an up-and-coming guitarist from the local scene. He'd seen Layne on stage and been floored by the raw power behind that voice. The timing was perfect. Cantrell's own band, Diamond Lie, had broken up. He had no place to live. So in a stroke of happenstance, he ran into Layne at a party. They got to talking, and Layne offered him a spot to crash at the Music Bank, a grungy rehearsal space where Layne was staying. The two realized they had uncanny musical chemistry. Cantrell recruited drummer Sean Kinney and bassist Mike Starr, forming a new project. He wanted Layne to front it, but ironically, Layne was still busy trying to keep a separate funk project afloat. That forced a standstill. Cantrell's group refused to settle for a different vocalist, and Layne insisted he was all in on the funk band. Eventually, Cantrell found a sneaky way to audition a series of terrible singers in front of Layne. Some were so bad it was comedic. Layne, disgusted, finally relented and said, "Okay, I'll sing for you guys, but you have to help with my funk band too." It was an uneasy arrangement, but soon enough that funk band folded, leaving Layne free to commit to Cantrell's group 100%. They toyed with various names, but eventually circled back to Layne's old band moniker, Alice in Chains. He had to ask permission from the previous members to resurrect the name, but they gave him the green light. Then, after a few close calls, like a bus shutting down their would-be studio session, the band recorded a demo that caught the ear of label scouts. By 1989, they'd signed with Columbia, and Layne Staley's fortunes were on the rise. He also found love around the same time. In the spring or summer of 1988, he met Demery Parrott, a model actress of sorts who worked at a local spot called Saturdays. Sparks flew immediately. Some friends said it was soulmates at first sight. He and Demery became inseparable, connected by intense romance, and also, tragically, by a shared vulnerability to addiction. They fell into the Seattle scene as it was blowing up with bands like Soundgarden and Pearl Jam. But they also found themselves flirting with increasingly dangerous substances. The euphoria of love and music collided with the perils of heroin creeping into their daily lives. In 1990, Alice in Chains burst onto the national scene with their debut album, Facelift. The single Man in the Box put them on MTV rotation, catapulting Layne's anguished wail into mainstream consciousness. He was a rock star at 23, yet behind the success, the seeds of addiction were taking root. By the time they released their second album, Dirt, 1992, the band soared even higher, with hits like Wood and Rooster cementing them as major players in grunge. Layne's voice, at once haunting and melodic, set them apart from other Seattle acts. They contributed music to the film's singles, played big tours. He and Demery got engaged, Everything might have looked unstoppable from the outside, but in reality his heroin habit was spiraling. He tried sporadically to keep a lid on it. The band's managers even hired security to keep dealers away on tour, but that rarely worked. Layne would sneak off or find a workaround. The band had to cancel gigs, shorten tours. The more success they tasted, the less Layne seemed able to handle it without the crutch of substances. By 1994, with the EP Jar of Flies topping charts, an unprecedented feat for an EP, he was further enslaved to heroin. The contrast was stark. The bigger their fan base, the deeper his personal freefall. Then heartbreak struck in his personal life. His engagement with Demery ended in late 1994, rumors swirling that their mutual drug use had become too destructive. That same year, the band decided not to tour behind Jar of Flies, partly to shield Layne from the temptations on the road, but it hardly helped. He kept using. In 1995, in an effort to distract or heal, he formed Mad Season, a supergroup with Mike McCready of Pearl Jam and others. The hope was that working with musicians who wanted sobriety might rub off on him, but even that only provided a brief lull in his downward trajectory. By 1996, Layne was painfully self-aware about how heroin had betrayed him. He told Rolling Stone that heroin had once felt like it helped him, but now it was destroying him. It was a heartbreak-laced confession, as if he was describing a toxic lover he couldn't quit. The fans adored him, but he was terrified that they might be following his example into addiction. Some bragged about using heroin because Layne did. That broke his heart further. He never wanted to be a role model for self-destruction. Alice in Chains recorded their self-titled album in 1995, but they didn't tour. Layne's health was too unstable. In July 1996, they played what would be his final show with the band, opening for Kiss. He tried to keep it together, but his arms bore the marks of repeated needle use, and his face was gaunt. Then, in October 1996, the love of his life, Demery Parrott, died of health complications tied to her own addiction. Layne was inconsolable. He practically barricaded himself away from the world, refusing to see most visitors, plunging into deeper isolation. Mark Lanegan of Screaming Trees would later say that from that point forward, Layne had no intention of continuing life. He was done. The heartbreak had broken him. He shut down, rarely leaving his Seattle condo. The band tried to coax him out for writing sessions or collaborations, but he mostly ignored them. He mustered enough energy to record 2 final songs with Alice in Chains in 1998, but physically, he was a shell of his former self. By the early 2000s, he was emaciated, reclusive, rumored to weigh under 90 pounds. He refused help. In a haunting final anecdote, Mike Starr, the band's former bassist, visited him on April 4th, 2002, Layne's 34th birthday. He found Layne extremely sick, suggested calling 911, but Layne refused. They argued, Mike left, and Layne called out after him, "Don't leave like this." Mike did. The next time anyone checked on Layne, he was already gone. The official discovery happened on April 19th, 2002, after Layne's accountants noticed there had been no spending on his debit card for over 2 weeks. They alerted his mother, Nancy McCallum, who came with the police. They broke into the condo and found him dead on his couch. He was 34, and the medical examiner concluded he died of an overdose, cocaine and heroin, a speedball, around April 5th, ironically just a day after Mike Starr's visit. That discovery date, April 19th, made it painfully reminiscent of Kurt Cobain's 1994 death, also discovered some days after the actual passing. Layne's mother was devastated, though she'd long feared this call. She was accompanied by her ex-husband Jim Elmer, and they saw the final scene no parent should ever witness. The heartache was immeasurable. In 2010, a grief-stricken Mike Starr revealed on a reality show that he was the last person to see Layne alive. He carried crushing guilt for leaving that day. He recounted how Layne had asked him not to leave, but he did anyway. Layne's mother tried to console Mike, saying that her son would have told him it wasn't his fault. Even so, Mike Starr himself died of an overdose the following year, echoing the tragedy that had claimed Layne. The heartbreak only compounded. Since 2002, Layne's memory remains woven into the fabric of Seattle's music legacy. His voice, unmistakable, both menacing and tender, helped define the 90s. Artists and fans frequently pay homage, some on the anniversary of his death, others on his birthday. Over time, the question always arises: how to reconcile the enormous talent of Layne Staley with the pain, addiction, and eventual fatal collapse that overshadowed his final years? The simplest answer might be that these were two facets of the same man. He had the capacity for transcendent artistry precisely because he felt everything so intensely, including heartbreak. For those close to him, the final meltdown was a slow-motion train wreck. They saw him falling, but couldn't force him to accept help. He seemed resigned to his fate, especially after losing Demery, the person he truly loved. They recall a man who would go out of his way to ensure no fan walked away disappointed, despite battling personal demons behind the scenes. They also recall a sense of childlike humor in him, a spark that made him grin even when discussing naming a band Alice in Chains or dressing up in drag for a laugh. That comedic streak, that irreverent perspective on life, kept him afloat for a time. But in the end, he no longer had the fight left. Today we listen to Man in the Box, Rooster, Wood, or the haunting ballads from Mad Season's Above album, and we hear that distinct, resonant wail. It's a voice that wraps pain and melody so heartbreakingly well that fans who grew up in that era can't help but feel a pang whenever they press play. Despite how the final chapter ended, that voice remains a monument. People still gather at tributes or watch old MTV Unplugged footage, remembering a moment in 1996 when Layne, seated, overcame unimaginable addiction to deliver a set that was raw and mesmerizing. Some see that as the last truly bright flame before the darkness closed in. He was just 34 when he died, his body discovered 2 weeks after the fact, with mother and father at the door. That's a detail that stings. A man so loved, so admired, had become so isolated that no one realized he was gone until half a month later. Fans who worshipped him from the 90s onward wonder if something more could have been done. If only the city's newfound focus on heroin outreach had come sooner, or if bandmates had done something different. But maybe it was unstoppable from the moment a 12-year-old Layne, furious about his middle name, channeled his heartbreak into music. Maybe all roads led here. We'll never know. In the wake of his passing, tributes poured in from across the music world. Jerry Cantrell, Sean Kinney, and Mike Inez, who replaced Starr on bass, carried on under the name Alice in Chains with a new singer, William Duvall. They insisted it wasn't about replacing Layne, but continuing the music in his honor. Each new album the band releases inevitably draws comparisons to the old days. Fans debate which era they prefer, but none can deny that the original synergy, that crackling spark, was intimately tied to Layne's presence, and that synergy, while magical, came laced with tragedy. Mothers, sisters, bandmates, girlfriends, they all tried to save him. Even his mother, initially outraged at Alice in Chains, ended up being one of his most staunch supporters, rallying behind him even as his addiction spiraled. Demery for a while seemed like a possible anchor for him, but her own struggles consumed her. The entire story unfolds like a slow, grim fairy tale, in which a gifted child with an otherworldly voice sets out to conquer stages, yet stumbles upon an enchanted curse, addiction, that eventually claims him. People can place blame on the music industry's glamorization of drug use in the 90s, or on the heartbreak of losing father and love, or on the swirl of Seattle's grunge scene that took so many lives. Possibly all of that is correct. The only certain fact is that Layne Staley fell, and he fell hard, leaving behind an emptiness. Yet out of that emptiness, we still have the artistry. His lyrics, tinged with self-reflection and bleak honesty, remain raw even after decades. His melodic lines, soaring and tortured, helped shape the entire alternative metal vibe that would define a generation. The heartbreak in Nutshell, the ominous hush in Down in a Hole, the desperation of Angry Chair, all these songs reflect the man who put all his anxieties into the microphone. They persist as a testament to the heights a tortured soul can reach and the agony it might cost them. If there's one final note to strike, it's that Layne Staley's memory is far from being purely a sorrowful footnote. Yes, he died alone, consumed by addiction in a messy apartment, missed by no one for weeks. That remains an unshakable tragedy. But the love that has surfaced in tributes, the tears that have been shed by fans at his memorials, the repeated references to his polite, gentle spirit, these show that Layne Staley wasn't just the moody frontman of a grunge band. He was a big-hearted kid who had the guts to push through stage fright, to defy motherly protests about band names, to experiment fearlessly with new sounds, and to invite a friend in need to share his meager rehearsal space. Those small acts of generosity might be overshadowed by the image of a rock star undone by heroin, but they deserve to be remembered. In the end, Layne Staley left behind a puzzle, the brilliance of his achievements and the tragedy of his last years. We can only honor him by looking at both. Yes, it's brutal that he died effectively alone. Yes, it's haunting that Demry's passing signaled a final emotional blow from which he couldn't recover. Yes, it's sad that a mother had to discover her son's body after 2 weeks. But it's equally true that he shaped a generation's music taste. It's equally true that he stood by lesser-known musician friends, gave them a chance, jammed with them, and in his own wounded way tried to keep the creative flame alive. The single thread weaving through his entire life was music. He told Dr. Seuss books at age 9 he'd be a singer, and he never broke that vow. Maybe the greatest heartbreak is that by the time he realized how lethal his addiction had become, he no longer saw a path out. He was 34. He'd grown from that emotional, name-hating boy to an adult who had soared, crashed, soared again, and drifted into tragic anonymity. The fans who still admire him see in his songs not just a reflection of the 90s grunge moment, but a reflection of raw human fragility. His voice, ironically so commanding on stage, masked a fragile heart that couldn't carry the weight of so many heartbreaks. The final message that emerges from Layne Staley's story is that behind every legendary vocalist, every rock god, there might be a child's heartbreak waiting for comfort. Sometimes no amount of success can outrun the shadows of the mind. Layne gave us that gift, a sonic feast of mesmerizing doom-laced harmonies. But his flame ultimately consumed him, and so we remember him. The boy who changed his middle name, who overcame a mother's disapproval of a band name, who gambled on a random encounter with Jerry Cantrell, who fell deeply in love with a woman that destiny would separate him from. The star who soared with Man in the Box, who created Wood as a testament to raw introspection, who spent his final years locked in a losing battle with a drug that had once seemed like a friend. In April 2002, He left this mortal stage in the same quiet way he'd left so many events before, retreating to the shadows, not wanting to burden others with his pain. That is the heartbreak of Layne Staley. But the beauty in his story is that he found his calling. He reached millions of people, and his voice still resonates across time. Even in his darkest confessions, he gave voice to feelings that so many share, though few can articulate. And for that, we can hold him in reverence, acknowledging that sometimes the purest voices come from the deepest wells of sorrow. We lost him too soon, but we still have the echoes he left behind in every chord and every lyric. And maybe that is how we honor him best.